Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little less academic and a lot more herbal, a slow, fragrant wander through the foggy, intoxicating world of medieval mind alteration. Yes, people in the Middle Ages did it, and trust me, things got weird. And sometimes surprisingly creative. But before we start, take a second to like the video only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love seeing how many corners of the world end up here together in the dark. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's slip into the past. It's tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as nothing but mud, monks, plagues, and potatoes. But under the wool cloaks and the occasional existential despair lived regular, flawed, experimental people who sometimes looked at a strange root and thought, well, let's see what happens if I boil this in hot wine. And honestly, who could blame them? No electricity, no coffee, no antidepressants. Local entertainment might be watching a knight try to read or seeing how long your neighbor could keep dancing before collapsing from ergot poisoning. So if someone whispered about a mushroom that made you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you'd probably chew it too. Contrary to what we often think, using substances to expand the mind, escape pain, or just make life slightly less miserable wasn't unusual, it was baked into the culture. But it wasn't called getting high. There were no medieval stoner duos giggling behind haystacks. Instead, it was cloaked in phrases like visionary states, divine inspiration, pain relief, or, in certain cases, oh no, doctors used herbs. Monks grew them. Witches, depending on who you asked, brewed, smeared, and whispered over them. Almost everyone encountered these substances at some point, whether through medicine, ritual, or an unfortunate run-in with moldy bread. And the medieval menu was more than just a tankard of warm ale, though that certainly helped. They had roots that screamed, flowers that blurred your vision, seeds that brought prophetic dreams, and ointments that could convince you you'd spent the night flying, naked through the sky, at a party catered by Satan. Mind-altering wasn't necessarily fun. In the modern sense, it could be medicinal, spiritual, or just very poor judgment on an empty stomach. And depending on your place in society, your dose might be given by a barber, surgeon, a nun, or a barefoot peasant named Wolf, who claimed to have learned his skills from a very wise squirrel. In the medieval world, you didn't need a shady alley or an exclusive club to get your hands on something potent, just a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a charming disregard for dosage. Nature was the dealer, and she wasn't always kind. Europe's fields and forests overflowed with plants, roots, fungi, and resins that could either cure your headache or make you believe you'd married a tree. The line between medicine and mystical trip was, shall we say, artistically interpreted. Physicians, monks, midwives, and wandering herbalists all worked with these botanicals, with varying levels of knowledge and restraint. If you wanted something to knock you out, calm your nerves, or make you see God in your soup, they had a remedy ready. Take henbane, for example, nature's version of Russian roulette. Prepared properly, it could ease pain and lull you to sleep. Prepared poorly, it could introduce you to convulsions and a sudden desire to sprint through the woods barefoot, screaming about the moon. Then there was the mandrake, a root shaped vaguely like a human, wrapped in more folklore than some saints. Legend claimed it screamed when pulled from the ground, a scream so deadly it could kill a man. Did that stop people? Of course not. They just tied the plant to a dog, backed away, and let the poor animal do the work. Consumed in small amounts, mandrake could bring on visions, prophetic dreams, and deep sleep. In larger doses, it could end your troubles permanently. And let's not forget belladonna deadly nightshade, a plant whose name alone should be warning enough. Used in tiny amounts, it could dilate pupils for beauty, dull pain, or spice up rituals. Too much, and it brought hallucinations, delirium, or a rather final form of relaxation. These plants weren't just eaten, they were brewed into teas, distilled into tinctures, crushed into oils, or worked into the infamous flying ointments. Of more on those soon. They might be taken willingly, administered during ceremonies, or rubbed on you by an overconfident apothecary, who thought a little extra root never hurt anyone. Spoiler, it did. Henbane, the medieval equivalent of pushing a mysterious button to see what happens. Known to botanists as *Hyaciemus niger*, and to everyone else as the stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was a duck, henbane was a cornerstone of the medieval apothecary's cabinet. Monks recorded its uses in herbals. Physicians relied on it to dull pain, witches supposedly used it in their broomstick travel arrangements, and peasants, mostly they hoped not to eat it by accident. In small doses, henbane acted as a sedative soothing toothaches, quieting sleepless nights, and making childbirth marginally less awful. In other words, it was the medieval equivalent of take two and try not to scream. But in larger amounts, or just unlucky timing, it could cause delirium, wild hallucinations, agitation, and in some cases, heartfelt conversations with vegetables you mistook for dead relatives. The plant contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, chemicals that scramble your brain's neurotransmitters, meaning visual distortions, confusion, dry mouth, extreme thirst, and possibly an unplanned dance performance were all possible side effects. Henbane could be smoked, brewed into tea, or mixed with animal fat and smeared onto the skin, a method popular among those who didn't care for reality arranged in a straight line. Was it legal? Technically, yes, medieval Europe didn't have controlled substances, but it was suspicious in the eyes of the church, where visions were meant to come from saints, not shrubs. Still, healers, mystics, and thrill seekers loved it enough to slip it into beer recipes. Until it was banned in favor of hops, few plants matched the mandrake in fear, fascination, and utter strangeness. Mandragora officinarum looked unsettlingly human when dug up, which, combined with its powerful effects, inspired a mix of awe and dread. It was said to bring fertility, deep sleep, vivid dreams, and visions, though in excess, it was more likely to bring you into close conversation with the afterlife. Harvesting it was considered so dangerous that instructions involved elaborate rituals, protective charms, and expendable dogs. Once in hand, it might be used in love potions, anesthesia, or mystical rites, but, like so many medieval cures, the difference between a dose and a death sentence was razor thin. These plants and their effects threaded through everyday medieval life in monasteries, in villages, in royal courts, and in the whispered gatherings of so-called witches. Sometimes they healed, sometimes they harmed, and sometimes they sent you on a journey you hadn't quite planned. In a world without synthetic drugs or modern medicine, nature offered both relief and risk in equal measure. And for the medieval mind, the veil between the medicinal, the mystical, and the dangerous was as thin as the parchment their herbals were written on. Medieval herbalists, whether genuine healers, cunning folk, or just that eccentric neighbor with too many jars of suspicious roots, believed with unwavering conviction that the mandrake root, often resembling a stubby, contorted human figure complete with what looked like arms, legs, and the occasional ruddy face, contained potent magical and medicinal properties that could sway the line between the physical and spiritual worlds. It was prized as a sedative, an anesthetic, an aphrodisiac, and, according to more mystical accounts, a conduit to prophetic dreams, with its essence said to be able to slip into your mind and show you visions of the future or the spirit realm. You could boil it in wine to dull pain. You could mash it into a paste for surgical numbing, or you could simply inhale its earthy, pungent fumes and be immediately rewarded with a kaleidoscope of bizarre sensations and the creeping suspicion that the walls were breathing. But the mandrake's true claim to fame came not from its medicinal versatility, but from its eerie and theatrical legend, that it screamed when uprooted, a scream so piercing and otherworldly that it could kill anyone unlucky enough to hear it, the sort of detail that ensured it lived rent, free in the imagination of every medieval child, apothecary, and would-be sorcerer. Texts from the era soberly warned that the cry could be lethal, which naturally inspired elaborate and grimly creative harvesting methods, the most infamous of which involved tying the root to a dog, retreating to a safe distance, and letting the unfortunate animal tug it free, absorbing the fatal scream in the process. A plan that raises more than a few ethical concerns, even by the low bar of medieval moral standards. Once the root was claimed, and once the dog had been properly mourned, or, in less sentimental cases, skinned for another recipe, the mandrake could be dried, powdered, steeped into infusions, or worn as a charm against evil spirits, infertility, or bad luck, because apparently nothing said romance. In the 14th century, quite like carrying a small mummified humanoid root that had, at least according to rumor, screamed itself hoarse, the Church, as one might expect, viewed mandrake lore with suspicion, its mine, daltering and dream, inducing qualities lumped into the same dubious category as pagan rites and witchcraft, and yet monks, those famously devoted to moderation, recorded highly specific mandrake recipes in herbal compendiums, noting its power to dull surgical pain, ease chronic insomnia, and provoke visions of astonishing clarity. Used carelessly, however, it could cause everything from violent vomiting to sudden unconsciousness to full-blown paranoid delusions in which one might accuse their stew of whispering treasonous secrets. And if you were a medieval noblewoman eager to turn heads at a feast, you could go the traditional route, fine linen gown, intricate braids studded with fresh flowers, or you could skip the subtlety and put actual poison in your eyes. Thus enters belladonna, also known as Atropa belladonna, or less clinically, deadly nightshade, a plant as seductively dangerous as its name implies, the botanical equivalent of an irresistible but wildly unpredictable lover. Its Italian name, translating to beautiful lady, comes from the cosmetic use of its extract, which, when dripped into the eyes, dilated the pupils to create a wide, dark, shimmering gaze considered not only attractive but vaguely saintly, though the price was blurred vision, painful light sensitivity, and the occasional accidental poisoning. Beyond its dubious contribution to beauty, belladonna also served as a painkiller, sleep aid, and in the hands of particularly optimistic or reckless interrogators, a truth serum, though the truths elicited might range from heartfelt confessions to rambling accounts of spectral processions in the rafters. Loaded with potent alkaloids like atropine and scopolamine, it could gently tip the nervous system into a dreamlike haze or hurl it headlong into a hallucinatory nightmare where the wallpaper melted and the saints descended for tea. Unsurprisingly, it cropped up in potions, flying ointments, and a number of surgical experiments that, from a modern perspective, were about as safe as juggling lit torches in a hayloft. Before the modern era gave us neatly packaged cannabis edibles in cheerful fruit flavors, the medieval world had its own array of intoxicating concoctions, though none would be mistaken for a snack. Ointments, balms, tinctures, and potions were the norm, their ingredients lists reading like a witch's inventory. Belladonna, henbane, mandrake, fat rendered from a black cat, a dash of hemlock, perhaps stirred counter-clockwise beneath a full moon for that extra kick. These were transdermal delivery systems in the loosest sense of the phrase, strange salves rubbed into the skin with the hope or certainty that their magic and medicine would seep directly into the bloodstream. For maximum effect, they were often applied to mucous membranes, a choice that might make the modern reader wince, but which made perfect sense to the medieval mind intent on rapid absorption. Thus the infamous flying ointments, thick blends of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and pig fat were sometimes applied to intimate areas, producing sensations of flight so intense that users reported soaring over villages, attending feasts in the courts of demons, or simply drifting on the wind like a leaf caught in an autumn updraft, only to awaken disoriented in a haystack or field, mouth dry, limbs sore, and utterly baffled. Other preparations were taken orally, often mixed into spiced wine, rich broth, or other liquids that masked their bitter taste, but not their strength. Poppy extract was especially valued for its capacity to numb a patient through crude surgical procedures or propel them into divine visions they hadn't exactly requested. Wandering physicians and quacks sold miracle elixirs from town to town, promising to heal heartbreak, plague, gout, or melancholy. though many of these tonics were as likely to remove paint as they were to restore health. The outcomes of these medieval edibles were gloriously unpredictable. One person might sleep peacefully, another might claim to converse with angels, and a third might end the night swearing undying loyalty to a turnip. And then, of course, there was the broomstick, that now cartoonish emblem of witchcraft which, in its own time, carried an uncomfortably risque implication. Inquisitors and moralists, eager to record every salacious detail, described witches using broomsticks or staves as tools for applying flying ointments to the most absorbent areas of the body, because swallowing the toxic blend was a fast track to the grave, but topical application offered a longer, stranger ride. The handle thus became less a household cleaning tool and more a pharmacological delivery device. Anointed with trance-inducing salve and straddled in private, after which the user might genuinely believe they had taken to the skies, in the hazy space where magic, medicine, and mysticism overlapped, these experiences were taken at face value, with some flights ending in descriptions of lavish infernal banquets and others in confused aerial wandering over thatched rooftops. Church authorities, unsurprisingly, focused less on the pharmacology and more on the theological implications, seeing these nocturnal voyages as undeniable evidence of demonic pacts. Never mind that the demons were likely just the side effects of belladonna and henbane doing what they do best. In the end, whether through roots that screamed like dying souls, flowers that promised beauty at the cost of sight, or ointments that sent minds flying without ever leaving the ground, the medieval world's blend of herbalism, superstition, and raw experimentation created a culture in which the line between cure and curse was perilously thin, and every remedy came with the unspoken understanding that you might well wake up healed, bewitched, or convinced the moon had personally invited you to dance. Hallucinations in the Middle Ages were often chemically induced and about as reliable as a drunk prophet, but since medieval justice never exactly required airtight evidence, no one worried much about the fine print, while much of Europe was smearing questionable ointments on broomsticks and calling it air travel. Something far more refined was happening to the south and east in the bustling centers of the Islamic Golden Age, where scholars, mystics, and physicians were perfecting the art of hashish, a plant-based solution for existential dread, camel traffic, and maybe just the general state of being alive. In the 12th century, derived from cannabis resin, hashish was consumed orally, usually blended with honey, spices, and herbs, making it the first edible in history to actually taste pleasant instead of like bitter regret and spoiled socks. Though recreational use certainly existed, hashish was often tied to Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam in which practitioners sought union with the divine, dissolving the ego, clearing the mind, and, at minimum, encouraging long and thoughtful stares at walls, while Sufi poets and philosophers described its effects in verses so abstract and emotional they might as well have been breakup songs, though not everyone adored the stuff, and Islamic rulers periodically tried to ban it over fears of laziness, moral decay, or laughter during prayer. Bans which worked about as well as convincing a cat to play fetch. Meanwhile, legends swirled about the Hashashin, assassins supposedly using hashish before missions, a story mostly mythical but too good to stop repeating. In contrast, Europe at the time was still centuries away from figuring out how to use cannabis without setting it on fire and calling it devil grass. When you picture a medieval church, you might imagine stained glass, flickering candles, solemn chants, and thick clouds of incense curling through the air like God's personal fog machine. But incense wasn't only for holiness. It had psychoactive potential too, with heavy hitters like frankincense and myrcinus imports from Arabia and East Africa, burned to cleanse air, repel evil, and mask the aroma of unwashed wool and fish stew. But modern science reveals that frankincense smoke contains incensol acetate, a compound that affects the brain's limbic system, meaning that if you sat in enough of that smoke, Gregorian chants weren't the only thing making your head feel floaty. In poorly ventilated chapels, so all of them, prolonged exposure could cause a mild tranquilizing effect, especially when combined with fasting, dehydration, or mind. numbing boredom, leading monks and worshippers to report visions they credited to divine inspiration when they might have been lightly buzzed on resin fumes. And this wasn't just a Christian quirk. Incense was standard in mosques, synagogues, Buddhist temples, and pagan rites, because apparently everyone loves a good vibe. Clerics swore it lifted the soul to heaven, but it might just have blurred reality enough to make a 5-hour sermon tolerable, the medieval equivalent of lo-fi beats and a scented candle, only with more Latin and fewer chill beats. If there was one constant in medieval life besides taxes and plague, it was alcohol: beer, ale, mead, wine, cider, brewed in barrels behind homes and monasteries, and often called medicine because water was basically poison unless you fancied dysentery. The solution was small beer, a low-alcohol brew consumed daily by adults and children not to get drunk but to survive, though it still delivered a gentle buzz and hydration. Richer folks, or the recklessly unemployed, went for strong ale, honey mead, or imported wine, which was often spiced or herbed for flavor, medicinal claims, or sheer curiosity. Monasteries made brewing a sacred craft, perfecting recipes and documenting fermentation with great enthusiasm, proving salvation might just come in pints, while taverns and inns served alcohol as medieval therapy, the cure for everything from tooth pain to heartbreak. Melancholy to judgmental poultry, encouraging gossip, celebrations, mourning, and the invention of terrible dance moves. Alcohol was, in essence, the social glue, liquid courage, and liquid anesthesia of the age. But sometimes getting high wasn't intentional. Hugh ergot, a parasitic fungus growing on rye and other grains, resembling a slightly off-color kernel to the medieval eye, but in reality a chemical prank loaded with alkaloids akin to LSD. When baked into bread, it could trigger convulsive ergotism, muscle spasms, seizures, hallucinations, uncontrollable laughter or terror, or gangrenous ergotism, where blood flow stopped and limbs blackened, shriveled, and dropped off like overcooked meat. Outbreaks struck entire villages, especially in damp climates like France and the Germanic regions, leading to surreal public episodes such as dancing plagues, in which crowds danced non-stop for days, sometimes to death, all while local priests debated whether it was demonic possession or divine punishment. In reality, it was just poisoned rye, proving the medieval diet could be as hazardous as medieval medicine. And speaking of medicine, or what passed for it, Europe had a long romance with plants both magical and murderous, like the mandrake root, prized by herbalists for its sedative, anesthetic, aphrodisiac, and dream-inducing powers, boiled in wine to ease pain or inhaled for visions so vivid they made you question every decision you'd ever made. The mandrake's fame came from the legend that it screamed when pulled from the earth, killing anyone who heard it, so harvesters tied it to a dog, walked away, and let the animal do the fatal pulling, a plan ethically dubious even by medieval standards. Once obtained, it could be dried, powdered, steeped, or worn as a fertility charm, despite the church's suspicion of anything vision, inducing outside its control. Used well, it dulled pain and treated insomnia. Used poorly, it caused vomiting, unconsciousness, or soup that whispered to you. Then there was belladonna, the beautiful lady, plant, deadly nightshade, whose eyed drop extract dilated pupils for that wide-eyed, mysterious look, though side effects included blurry vision, light sensitivity, and occasional death. It also served as a painkiller, sleep aid, truth serum, and prime ingredient in witches' flying ointments. Potent salves of belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and animal fat applied to mucous membranes, yes, those for hallucinatory flights, visions of soaring to Sabbaths, dining with devils, or floating like a confused medieval drone. Broomsticks in this context were less about sweeping and more about ointment delivery systems, a detail that inquisitors eagerly recorded as proof of witchcraft. Never mind that it was just toxicology at work. Ointments, bombs, tinctures, and potions were the edibles of their time, absorbed through skin or swallowed in wine, broth, or whatever passed for drinkable liquid. capable of knocking you out, sending you into ecstatic trances, or convincing you you'd turned into a lizard. Apothecaries mixed poppy extract with spiced wine for surgeries or divine visions, while wandering quacks hawked elixirs that could cure heartbreak, plague, or a stubborn shrews. Alts varied wildly, from peaceful sleep to swearing loyalty to a turnip. Between hashish-fueled Sufi meditations, incense, scented semi-trances, perpetual mild alcohol intoxication, ergot. Induced village raves, mandrake whispering in your pouch, belladonna flights on not-so-innocent broomsticks, and the occasional miracle cure that doubled as poison, the medieval world was less the grim, sober place we imagine and more a kaleidoscope of accidental chemistry, improvised pharmacology, and deeply committed experimentation. Proof that while the tools were primitive, the human desire to alter reality, seek visions, and escape the drafty, plague-ridden present has always been timeless. The Middle Ages were not exactly known for their gentle spa treatments or their rigorous scientific method, but they were surprisingly inventive when it came to altering the human mind, intentionally or otherwise. We're talking about a time when people thought disease could be caused by a sneeze from the devil, when bread was considered both holy and suspicious, and when medicine was a mix of Latin prayers, random plant mash, and the occasional live pigeon applied to the wound. Yet in the middle of all this superstition and survival, medieval people were encountering substances, sometimes plants, sometimes fungi, sometimes honey, that could warp reality in ways they didn't always understand, but often found strangely useful. Take ergot, for example, the uninvited guest in rye bread. Modern science tells us ergot is a fungus that produces alkaloids related to LSD. Back then, people just thought the bread had gone a bit spirited. Entire villages could come down with St. Anthony's fire, a name that sounds like a medieval cocktail, but actually described a nightmarish combination of burning limbs, convulsions, gangrene, and terrifying visions. The cause, ergot, infected rye. The explanation at the time, demons, divine punishment, or moral weakness. The truth was more mundane and far more absurd. They were all essentially tripping on contaminated toast. Ironically, the Order of St. Anthony, who ran hospitals for victims, treated the afflicted by switching them to wheat bread instead of rye. Yes, the miracle cure was different carbs. Did anyone figure it out? Not really. To the medieval baker, bread was either fine or deeply possessed, and no one was about to test for psychoactive alkaloids when they were too busy trying not to be excommunicated. Some scholars even suggest ergot played a role in the Salem witch trials centuries later. Hallucinations, paranoia, and fits all match the symptoms. But that's still debated. What's not debated is that medieval Europe got high on toast without even knowing it. But bread wasn't the only way to turn your reality upside down. Have you ever heard of mad honey? In a few special corners of the medieval world, even the bees were in on the fun. This wasn't your friendly grocery store squeeze bottle honey. We're talking about a rare type produced in the mountainous Black Sea regions of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where bees feasted on pink rhododendron flowers containing gray anotoxins, compounds that seriously mess with the human nervous system. The result, honey that could make you dizzy, hallucinate, vomit, slow your heart rate, and, if you were lucky, grant you spiritual visions, though possibly while lying on the floor wondering if your soul had left without you. In small doses, mad honey gave a pleasant buzz. In large doses, it turned life into a slow-motion opera starring your own eyebrows. And it wasn't just a local novelty, it was weaponized. Ancient and medieval sources describe invading armies poisoned with mad honey, left in tempting pots in abandoned villages. Soldiers thought they'd found a sweet windfall, only to wind up convulsing in the dirt. Greek and Roman authors like Xenophon and Strabo wrote about it centuries earlier, but the practice persisted well into the Middle Ages. Locals knew how to handle it, a little on bread for a headache, a little in wine for visions, or none at all if you wanted to remember your own name by dusk. Some users claimed it brought prophetic dreams. Others woke up clutching a potato they thought was their uncle. Results varied. It was sold in small ceramic jars, usually without dosage instructions, because in a world where leeches were considered advanced medicine, who needed warning labels. Then there were the people who really understood the botanical underworld, cunning folk, shamans, herbalists, legitimate healers operating on the fringes of society. Think of them as medieval pharmacists with no regulation and a personal relationship with moss. These were the ones you visited when the town physician suggested bloodletting for your toothache. They had no formal degrees, but a lifetime of inherited plant knowledge, much of it learned from grandmothers who treated boils with bark and dignity. Many were women, midwives, wise women, healers, vital to their communities yet feared by church and state because they didn't need Latin or holy relics to cure people. They knew the dosages that could heal you, the ones that could make you dream of angels, and the ones that might accidentally send you to meet those angels in person. Their toolkits included henbane, mandrake, belladonna, poppy, and other plants with a foot in both medicine and magic. They'd brew teas to dull pain, make ointments to induce visions, or prepare charms to curse an unfaithful neighbor. Preparations were mixed with wine, honey, animal fat, or less appetizing, spit, and accompanied by chants for protection. If things went wrong, hallucinations of flying goats or the sudden urge to marry a tree could be blamed on witchcraft. The church kept a close eye on them, branding some practices as heretical, but communities still relied on their skills for everything from childbirth to joint pain to ghost consultations, which brings us to a central medieval paradox: how did people feel about getting high? The answer is hilariously conflicted. For healers and herbalists, mind-altering substances were just another tool. If it dulled pain, slowed a racing mind, or made childbirth less horrifying, it was welcome. This was medicine, not mischief. Even if the patient started speaking in tongues or insisting the cat was reciting scripture, monks and mystics sometimes used intoxicants to aid in visions and divine communication, interpreting hallucinations as signs of sanctity rather than symptoms. In these circles, staring into the void and having the void whisper back in Latin could earn you sainthood, or at least your own mural, but intent mattered. Accidental intoxication was fine. Taking something to see Jesus could be acceptable. Taking something to flirt with goat demons, that was heresy territory. For the church, any substance that caused a loss of control was suspect. Saints could have visions. Peasants were probably possessed. Meanwhile, the common folk had a more practical view. If it worked, it worked. Poppy wine for pain, hashish for calm, henbane tea for difficult in-laws. It was all part of the medicine chest, right next to garlic and prayers. And of course, not all medieval highs came from food or drink. Some were rubbed directly on the skin. Enter henbane, known to botanists as Hyoscyamus niger, and to Uncle Bernard as the stuff that made me think I was a duck. Used for centuries across Europe, henbane was the medieval equivalent of a handle with care, label nobody read. In small doses, it eased pain, soothed nerves, and helped with insomnia. In larger doses, it caused delirium, hallucinations, and the occasional heartfelt conversation with a turnip you believed was your late grandmother. Containing scopolamine and hyoscyamine, it disrupted neurotransmitters, leading to visual distortions, disorientation, dry mouth, and sometimes spontaneous interpretive dance. Henbane was brewed into tea, smoked, or mixed into ointments for absorption through the skin, ideal for anyone who preferred their consciousness scrambled. Technically legal, it was controversial with the church, but beloved by healers, mystics, and brewers before hops replaced it in beer. Then there was mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, the root that looked suspiciously like a human figure, and inspired equal parts awe and terror. Folklore claimed it screamed when uprooted, killing anyone who heard it. The solution was to tie it to a dog and let the animal do the pulling while you stood at a safe distance. Mandrake could induce sleep, visions, and so they said fertility, but also death if you got the dose wrong. And belladonna, or deadly nightshade, might be the most honest plant name in history, used to dilate pupils for beauty, treat pain, or cause hallucinations. It was a favorite in flying ointments that allegedly allowed witches to soar through the night. Whether anyone actually flew or simply passed out imagining it is debatable, but the ointments often combined belladonna, henbane, and mandrake, meaning their users were absolutely flying in some sense. All of this paints a picture of a world where intoxication existed in a strange limbo between medicine, magic, accident, and crime. You could get high in a monastery garden, in a healer's hut, in a battlefield honey trap, or simply at breakfast if the rye harvest had been unlucky. Sometimes it was for healing, sometimes for visions, sometimes because someone misidentified a plant, and always under the shadow of moral judgment, depending on who you were, why you took it, and whether anyone tattled. In the medieval mind, altered states lived in a hazy space between miracle and misdemeanor, health and heresy. In a world where demons, saints, plagues, and turnip famines all walked hand in hand, a little herbal escape was hardly the worst idea. And of course, no medieval intoxicant list would be complete without touching on alcohol, the socially acceptable, legally blessed, and absolutely omnipresent lubricant of medieval life, because water, even in rural villages, was often unsafe to drink without boiling, and beer or ale low alcohol, small beer, for daily hydration, stronger stuff for celebrations, was safer, tastier, and conveniently made you less concerned about the mud on your bread, with monasteries perfecting brewing techniques that balanced nutrition, flavor, and potency in ways that made them both spiritual centers and the happiest places in town. And it wasn't just barley. Wines, meads, and ciders flavored with herbs, spices, and honey could be surprisingly strong, sometimes so fortified with extra fermentation tricks that you'd be swaying after 2 goblets, which, considering goblets were basically medieval soup bowls, wasn't a surprise. And these drinks weren't just for pleasure. They were vessels for medicine, carrying dissolved herbs like wormwood, mugwort, or rosemary, creating concoctions that could either settle your stomach or send you to the rafters for an imaginary owl conversation, depending on dosage. And if your tastes leaned toward the Eastern trade, imported hashish was known in parts of Europe thanks to contact with the Islamic world during the Crusades, often arriving as a pressed resin mixed with honey or spices, part medicinal, part recreational, and wholly exotic to anyone outside of port cities. And while it never became as culturally entrenched as wine, it fascinated chroniclers enough to earn it a semi-mythical reputation as something that made poets more profound, warriors more fearless, and bakers more likely to forget the bread in the oven. And speaking of imports, opium, long used in the ancient world, filtered into Europe through trade routes, prized as both a painkiller and a sleep aid, sold in apothecaries in the form of thick resin or infused wine, and in the right dose, it was a gentle, blessed relief from chronic pain or post-battle agony, but in the wrong dose, it could send you straight to the afterlife with a serene smile. And just as today's pharmaceuticals come with warnings in tiny print, medieval opium came with no such guidance, just the herbalist's wink and the hope you wouldn't come back to haunt them. And while we're in category of unintentional highs, let's revisit the issue of fermented or spoiled food, because with preservation methods limited to salting, smoking, drying, or burying in a cool hole in the ground, medieval people were no strangers to strange tastes and side effects, and sometimes cheese aged in unexpected potency or fermented fruit produced unexpected side effects, creating what could generously be called culinary adventures, and less generously called the weak. Father Thomas thought the rooster was a messenger from God. And let's not forget mushrooms, those forest floor mysteries, some of which were delicious, some edible only once, and some like Amanita muscaria, the iconic red capped toadstool used in folk rituals for its psychoactive properties, producing effects ranging from euphoria to terrifying visions, often depending on preparation, dose, and whether you were doing it intentionally or just unlucky. And certain cultures, particularly in the far northern fringes of Europe, had traditions involving these mushrooms that may have carried into whispered medieval tales of berserkers and strange winter rituals, and the overlap between shamanic practice, folk medicine, and early Christian superstition created a fertile ground for both actual use and wild rumors. And rumors in the Middle Ages could spread faster than plague. Whisper that your neighbor's ointment made her fly, and suddenly the Inquisitor was in town taking statements from every old lady with a herb garden, which is why so many recipes, especially for strong intoxicants, were guarded closely, passed orally, or hidden in code in manuscripts so that the uninitiated wouldn't misuse them or get you burned at the stake. And this secrecy is why, even today, historians have to piece together the reality of medieval highs from court records, recipe books, medical treatises, and the occasional confused monk's diary entry. And those diaries sometimes reveal a startling honesty, like the Cistercian monk who recorded his own dream visions after consuming certain herbs for contemplative purposes, describing landscapes of unearthly beauty, winged figures speaking riddles, and the sense of being both in and outside of his body, a description that, to a modern reader, sounds suspiciously like a trip report from an internet forum. And while modern people tend to think of intoxication as recreational, in the Middle Ages it was often spiritual, medicinal, or accidental first, recreational second, though that didn't stop people from enjoying it once they realized the effects, and the line between those categories could be as thin as a sprig of rosemary, because a painkiller could become a vision inducer if you added a little too much henbane, and a vision inducer could become a poison if you were careless or unlucky, and that risk-giver, present unpredictable, gave medieval intoxicants a reputation of both awe and fear, so much so that even when the church condemned certain practices as witchcraft or diabolical trickery, people kept using them quietly in kitchens, forests, and behind closed shutters, because in a world where childbirth could kill you, surgery meant screaming until you passed out, and winter could last half the year. A little escape was worth the gamble, and perhaps that's the most human thing about the whole story. Whether in the form of a spiked mead, a hallucinogenic root, or a suspiciously strong cheese, medieval people sought out altered states for the same reasons we do now: to ease pain, to seek insight, to bond with others, to forget their troubles, and sometimes just to see what would happen. And what happened was 1,000 little stories, mostly lost to time, but hinted at in the strange margins of manuscripts, in the gossip of trial records, and in the quiet persistence of certain recipes that survived, tucked between psalms, or copied into herbals, waiting for someone curious enough to try them again. And so the next time you picture the Middle Ages as a grim, gray slog of toil and prayer, remember the hidden layer, the gardens thick with secret herbs, the beehives producing treacherous honey, the bakers unwittingly creating visions, the apothecaries bottling strange dreams, and the villagers who, whether through ritual, remedy, or reckless curiosity, sometimes walked in a world entirely of their own making, half real, half imagined, wholly medieval.